Okay, so hello again, everyone. Welcome back, and it's really nice to see you again today at our very first session about preprints. And I think it's going to be a very exciting session because we already touched upon it, and there were so many questions. So I hope that with these series of three sessions, then all the questions would be answered. So again, we'd like to thank our funder, ORFG, for providing us with the fund to get the infrastructure needed for the training, and for our trainers who are all volunteering with their very valuable time to do this training. And I'd like again to remind everyone with the code of conduct that we'd like to maintain. And in case there were any violation in this code of conduct, please contact us via email or use the incident report form that you already have in your Google folder for the training. So to introduce our trainer today, our trainer is Jonny Coates from ASAPbio. And Jonny is actually a scientist who's interested in immune cell biology, but then he shifted gears in 2019 into the world of preprints and meta science, and everything since he's been very active in that area. And in 2021, he launched the Preprints in Motion podcast, which focused and highlighted the benefits of preprint for early career researchers. And now he's the associate director of ASAPbio since 2023. So please, let's all welcome Jonny, and we hope to have a very fruitful session. So with that, I'll stop sharing, and the floor is yours, Jonny.
Thank you. My face back in. Okay, so lots of questions is good. I'm going to try and get through this with plenty of time to do a bit of a Q&A afterwards. If you do have any questions when I finish this or as I go, you can email me, and I'm fairly responsive, although things are a bit crazy at the moment, so it might take me a little while to respond. You can also find me or ASAPbio on just about every social platform in existence at the moment, and there's a lot of them. Or as I go through, also feel free to interrupt and stop me and ask questions. The chat box is open on a different screen, so I should be able to see things as they pop up if I'm paying attention. And if I see anything, I will come to it as it comes up. So before I get started, I just got a couple of slides on ASAPbio and sort of what these sessions will do. So ASAPbio, if you're not familiar with us, we are a researcher-driven non-profit organization, and our aim is to make life science communication faster and more transparent. And we do this by promoting the productive use of preprints and open peer review and things like that. The organization is actually based in San Francisco. It was created in about 2016, I think, by our previous executive director, Jessica, who is amazing. If you ever get the chance to come across Jessica and interact with her, you absolutely should. We've just appointed a new executive director, who sadly is not me. And I've been with the organization now for about a year. Prior to that, I was actually already doing a lot of this job for free in my own spare time. So I've been active in this space for quite a few years now. And these sessions, at least at level 1 for now, are going to take the form of 3 sessions. So today we're going to cover an introduction to preprints and preprint servers. Next week we will go over the history of preprints, and we'll do that in the context of the history of publishing and peer review a bit more broadly. We'll also cover the current landscape. And then the third session in 3 weeks' time, 2 weeks' time, Claire will be running that session. That's going to be around the benefits, concerns based around preprints. In level 2, we will do another 3 sessions. The first will be more around how to choose an appropriate preprint server and how to get involved with preprints. There's a bit of that in today as well. The second session there will be a much deeper look at preprint peer review. And then we'll have an entire session that is about actually getting involved with preprints and how you can expand their visibility and use those better. Well, today we're going to, it's sort of a 50-50 split. We're going to do, the first half is very much based on the issues with the current system and leading into why preprints are the answer before I actually get into preprints and preprint servers. And then we've also got a little bit at the end about how you could start to get involved with preprints, which to be honest is mainly just a bunch of ASAPbio resources. But there are other resources available. So the current system, as I'm sure you've probably heard of already from a few of the other speakers. So we've had a lot of technological advances in the past few years. And you would think this would all mean scientific publication and scientific communication has kind of kept pace with this and is completely different to how it used to be in the past. Sadly, it's not. It's one of those weird industries where academic publishing is very much stuck in a print, pre-internet mindset, which is bizarre to me. And despite all these advances, publication is actually taking longer than it ever has. These are two of my favorite graphs, if you can have a favorite graph. So this first one here is showing the time it takes to get your first author paper. And in the 1980s, this was just under, on average, 5 years. In 2012 to 2014, this had jumped up to, I think this is actually about 6.5 years on average. And of course, that was 10 years ago now, so it's going to have jumped up a bit more since. And this is really damaging to early career researchers in particular. And then this other plot here is showing you the number of panels within papers published in Cell, Nature, or the Journal of Cell Biology in the 1980s versus 2014. And this, I think, is really striking in terms of how much work is now required to actually publish a paper. So if you look at the 1984 data, you can see that generally it was always below 20 total number of panels in the paper. And then by 2014, not only had this doubled, if not tripled in some cases, we also had supplemental data now, where at best, the supplemental data was as much data as required for a full paper in the 1980s, in the case of JCB here. In the case of Nature, the supplemental data is something like 5 times greater now than an entire paper in 1984. This is not sustainable. This is not speeding up science. And I would also argue this is not necessary. We don't need to have a huge amount of data in a paper for that paper to be reliable and good. And this is probably a byproduct of the peer review system we currently have, but it's also just due to the amount of techniques that have come along in that time. You do something like single cell sequencing, you're going to get a lot of different panels. So it's not all bad, but it's definitely not all good either. We also see that journal publication is heavily dependent on name recognition and effectively, have you published in this journal before? So this is data from a paper that looks beyond just Nature, but Nature is a good example to use here. So in Nature, what this image here is showing you is that if you have published in Nature before, whether that is as an established PI or you've been chaperoned, so you've been an author somewhere on that Nature paper, you are more likely to get into Nature than if you are coming at as a new PI. So if you've never published in Nature before and you try to get published, it used to be pretty even. But by 2010, that had very much changed. And there's quite big disparity between having published before and not having published before, and the chances of now publishing in Nature. And this isn't because those who've published before are doing the better science. It's not a great situation to be in. This is not just Nature, this is all the big journals have this issue. And this is also showing a similar thing for a different journal. So how many times you've published in terms of the publications you have as non-last author, and the probability of transitioning to the last author in these journals. And again, basically what it's showing is the more times you've published in these journals, the greater the chance you have of independently publishing in these journals. Effectively, together, this tells you that you need to be in a lab as an early career researcher, that is publishing in Nature in order to publish in Nature yourself as an independent researcher. The other thing is that there's a huge amount of cost involved in all of this. And there's 2 points here showing slightly different points, but they're both cost related. So one estimate recently put the global cost of peer review at somewhere around the $6 billion mark. Now, it's a very difficult thing to actually estimate the cost, so this isn't necessarily an accurate number, but it's probably somewhere within that region. That's a huge amount of money. The other thing here, though, is that's a huge amount of money that journals are saving, because this is largely coming from peer reviewer time and the wages that would be spent on doing that kind of job. So peer review is costing us a lot of money, but also publishing is costing us a lot of money. This chart here is showing you the article processing charges, or the revenue, sorry, from article processing charges, broken down by discipline. The thing I like about this image is it really highlights just how much of these issues are actually very life science focused. They're not unique, so engineering technology is there's a lot of money there, a lot of money in social science, agricultural sciences, even humanities. But they pale, even when you add them all up, in comparison to how much revenue is generated by the natural and the health sciences. And so this is not, as I said, it's not uniquely a life science issue, but it's so heavily a life science issue that I kind of feel like you're almost wasting your efforts trying to change the other systems if you don't change or if you don't impact life sciences. And this is revenue. This is money that is going directly towards the publishers. And that's a problem when the system is designed to be profit driven, not science driven. And I can't remember if I have slides about that in here or not, but I wish I had. Just another slide here on the cost of open access. So open access has been around for over like 30 years now. And there's certainly last year, there was a lot of articles around how open access has failed. Now, I'm not sure I completely subscribe to the notion that it has failed. I think it's achieved some things and not achieved other things. One of the things that has happened with open access in particular here is that I would say publishers have kind of co-opted this model. So before open access, you had individual article charges for individual researchers, and you had subscriber agreements with universities. That's primarily how a publisher might make money. With open access, we introduced the article processing charges. And actually, the frustrating thing here is these actually came from journals like PLOS. They were the ones who pioneered this kind of model. And the article processing charges introduced an extra layer of costs. Effectively, the attempt is to shift the cost from the reader onto the author. And what this chart is showing you is, again, it's an estimate, but between 2015 and 2023, this is roughly how much revenue was generated from just the article processing charges for various numbers of publishers. And you can see this is somewhere estimated to be about $5.42 billion. Now, a more accurate estimate, which is from 2015 to 2017, places this around $1 billion for that time period. Again, because this is a difficult number to actually really estimate accurately, how correct this number is questionable, but it's going to be in the billions in terms of the dollars amount that is revenue generated. And again, this is money that could be put back into science. This is money that could be spent paying peer reviewers or improving a lot of the research culture issues we see. And instead, it's going to primarily shareholders. And we really need to question the morality and ethical nature of doing something like this. And tied in with all of this is that despite all these advances we've had, science as a whole continues to rely on incredibly poor proxies. And these are things like brand names, so this could be the journal name, or things like the journal impact factor. And tying in just with the last couple of slides about profit generating, you may have seen last year that Taylor and Francis, I think it was Taylor and Francis or Wiley, can't remember. The Hindawi brand was retired because there's been a lot of issues with that brand. Those journals haven't been retired. Those journals still exist. They've just been rebranded. And so the problem hasn't really gone away. It's just marketing speak. And the problem with brand name or impact factor or any of these other proxies that we use is it takes away from the actual science and from judging the quality of the science. What you're seeing here on the left is this article is a pretty good example of why you shouldn't use the impact factor. This one on the left is an indicator of how journals can manipulate the impact factor. So what you're seeing is, certainly with the big journals, so Cell, Nature, and Science right at the top again, what they do is they front load with various other articles. So these could be things like letters to the editor, news, editorials, and these things inflate the journal impact factor to being much higher than it should be if you were to use it correctly. That's only one way of gaming the impact factor. And you can see it also happens with other journals, although to a much lesser extent. The other image you're seeing here is effectively trying to explain why using the impact factor doesn't work. It can heavily be skewed by some very small numbers of papers that do get a huge number of citations. For the most part, any journal that is publishing papers will not get the majority of their papers receiving those kind of citation levels. And this skews the impact factor massively away from what the reality of that journal is. And so you really can't use these metrics to judge an individual paper from any journal. You have to look at the science, but by using these factors and these proxies, as I said, we take away from focusing on the science. And that's really kind of one of the aims of preprints, is to try and focus us back in on the scientific content. And the other thing here is that all of this kind of relies on the system of peer review. Now, you could have a whole separate talk about peer review and the issues with peer review. What I've done here is I've just bullet pointed some of the bigger ones. There's plenty of places you can go and read about to find all the evidence behind this, but there's 2 points I want to make here. Firstly, the peer review systems we currently use is not that old. A lot of people like to say it's over 350 years old, we've been doing it forever. We haven't. We've been using this since about the 1970s, so it's really not old at all. And it's also evolved over a few hundred years to being various different forms and used in different ways and meant to stand for different things. And so this is a thing that evolves and can change. So we don't need to stick with what we have at the moment. We can change it and adapt it. And the other thing is, it really does not work. It is an experiment that has failed. And you cannot look at the data and the evidence that exists and come to any other conclusion. The problem is, this is the business model now for journals. This is how they separate themselves out from things like preprints. And there is a value in peer review. I'm of the opinion that we don't need to peer review everything, and we should have a system that really focuses in on the things that need a deep review. And we should really focus some of that effort instead on correcting the literature and actually protecting the literature from damaging papers. But even if you want that put aside, there is a place for peer review. However, not in its current form. So modern peer review, as I said, it's a very recent experiment. It's filled with bias on gender, race, prestige, the Matthew effect. It's really hard to get away from that bias. There's a lot of attempts with double blind, triple blind. It doesn't really help. The other thing is that reviewers consistently just do not agree with each other. The evidence that looks at this shows you repeatedly that reviewers do not agree on the same paper. And you would expect something like peer review, where you're trying to judge maybe the impact or the quality. People should be able to agree on those things, and they don't. Peer review does not detect fraud. It's not designed to detect fraud. And therefore, it's not actually protecting the literature in the way that a lot of people seem to assume it is. It's also a very expensive and slow process. I'm sure if any of you are on any social media, you've come across plenty of editors who are crying out about how difficult it is to currently find peer reviewers. And that can be improved with open review, with preprint-based peer review, or moving peer review not as a journal system, but as a separate entity. So you have your article, you send it to a peer review system, and then that together could go to a journal. It's also very poor at detecting gross defects in articles, which kind of links back to not detecting fraud. But probably the more important thing here is that it's hugely over relied upon and often perceived as a stamp of approval for a bit of work. And that again takes us away from actually assessing the quality of the science as we read it and as we use it. And this has led to all kinds of issues. The NMR autism conspiracy is probably a very good example, but there are plenty of others. And the difference between this and a non-reviewed preprint is that at least a non-reviewed preprint doesn't have that stamp of approval. People read them generally with more caution. And that's how we should be reading everything that we come across in literature. And the problem, well, the reason all these issues exist, I would say, is because publishing is currently quite tangled up. It's a lot of different things in one. So publishing, as we currently use it, is dissemination, peer review, curation, and prestige. And that is all controlled by journals. They do all of these different steps. And I think it's too much to ask of an individual organization. But this also results in a motivation to delay the creation, or delay the sharing of your work for the creation of a complete story. And that's because that complete story is what currently gets scientists jobs and funding. And that's not how science really works, and we can improve that process. The other thing here, of course, is that this is an entirely profit-driven process for the most part, and that is at odds with serving the community. You can't do both. Well, you can do both, but you can't put community first. One or profit first, community first. It's a choice. And so what we really need to do is disentangle these steps and make them separate individual steps. So dissemination should be preprints. Peer review should be preprint peer review and should be open and transparent. And then curation and prestige should also be separated out. So curation could be where journals come in and they actually bring together things that they deem would actually be quite impactful, however they might want to measure that. And then prestige, I think, should also be separate from curation, and prestige needs time. That is the step where you really can't get ahead of it. It's very difficult to judge the value of work as it's currently being published. You need to give it time to effectively let other people build on that to find out how important something was. And the final point on this section, the real danger here is actually not just publication. It's not just the publishing system. It's that the traditional publishers dominate the entire aspect of academia. Everything from how you discover papers right through to how you are assessed as a researcher. These are just two examples, but there's a lot more. If we don't break this dominance, we can't put academia first. We can't escape from the research culture issues and the mental health issues that arise largely from assessment practices that restrict jobs, restrict funding, or turn it all into what is effectively a lottery because it doesn't make any sense. Now, in my mind, the way to break this is to break the publication step, as I've just shown on the slide before. If we do that, we begin to separate out more of these things, and it's not as big a deal that all these things are owned by individual companies. It's not quite as dominating if we can separate this out. So if those are all the problems, what's the solution? And I would argue the solution are preprints. So preprints are manuscripts that are shared online prior to journal organized peer review. That's important because it does not mean they are not peer reviewed. It just means it's not a journal organized review process. They are permanent records with a DOI. They are versioned and you can update a preprint as much as you like. They are citable and should be cited if you come across and use them for any part of your research. And they are searchable and they're indexed by things like EuropePMC. PubMed have not that long ago started also indexing preprints. And my definition of a preprint is that it's a manuscript shared when the authors believe their work is ready for sharing. Now, this means these are not rushed things. I think people often forget academia is based on reputation. Everyone in a field knows the people who do really crap science or who scoop and steal other people's ideas. Equally, everyone knows the people in the field who are just generally brilliant scientists. And so I don't understand why anyone would have an issue with those people being the ones who decide when the work is ready to be shared with the world, especially given that these are not final things. You can update them. And people do in response to feedback and comments. The other thing is that they're very easy to remove and withdraw if you needed to, if it was problematic. And COVID was a really good example of where that happened quite well. What preprints are not is that they are not preliminary versions of an article. Now they can be, and that can be in a very positive way. So for example, you could have work in progress and you post the initial version of that as a preprint. You might be doing that to get feedback, or you might just be doing it as something so it's out there and you can build on it. And then you update that once you've got some more experiments in, and then you update it again. Maybe you get some feedback and you update it again. I've done this with some of my work in the past. That actually led to us co-submitting the final version with another group in the US who paid our article processing charge for us, which was very kind of them. If they hadn't done that, that work would never have been published. It would have remained as a preprint. Preprints are not poor quality. Now, there's no study yet that's actually looked at the quality of preprints that are never published. But just because a preprint is not published, it does not mean it's poor quality. As I said, I've just given you an example of where I was going to leave work as a preprint, and it wasn't because it was poor quality, it was because I couldn't afford the article processing charge. People leave preprints up without publishing because that's what they want to change the system, and so they believe in it so strongly they won't submit to a journal. Some people do it because it's not stuff a journal would take. You can post negative data as a preprint. You can post small data sets. Everyone knows PIs who have like drawers and filing cabinets of data that they've just amassed over a whole career, and they've never published or shared with the world because it's not a story or it's not something that a journal would publish. It's not poor quality, it's just difficult to publish. Preprints are also not untrustworthy, which very much links to that quality issue. They are also not posted by anyone and everyone. This is a common myth that you come across with preprints. I'm going to show you one server in particular about how they screen some manuscripts that are submitted to them. But there are steps to prevent just anything being posted on a preprint server. Generally, most preprint servers require the stuff on there to actually be scientific. And they're also not open to having anything posted. As I've just said, you can't just post whatever you want on a server. So how does this look alongside the current system? So the current system, you have your manuscript, you submit it to a journal. The editor may or may not send that out for peer review. If it doesn't, it goes to another journal. Maybe this time the editor sends it out for peer review. Some of the peer reviewers like it, some of them don't. It might go for multiple rounds of revision, but for whatever reason, maybe the editor also rejects it then. So it goes to another journal. And we repeat this cycle over and over again until eventually the editor and the peer reviewers all agree that it should now be published. This can take months to years. On average, this takes longer than it does to gestate a human baby. It takes longer than 9 months. And you can already see just from this how much waste is in this system as it currently stands. A waste of time, a waste of money. I mean, we are potentially talking of multiple sets of peer reviewers reviewing effectively the same manuscript. And after this process occurs, often behind closed doors, so nobody knows it's happening, your paper is then published to the world and people can actually access the research. It's kind of a bit useless if it's 2 years old, I think, but preprints, on the other hand, you submit your manuscript to a preprint server, and generally within 48 hours, your manuscript will be available publicly. So it's free to do this process and it's free to read the preprints. And once you've done this, your manuscript is now open for community feedback and ideas and discussion, and people can actually use it and build off of your work. This 48-hour is based on the screening time at bioRxiv, and even during the height of the COVID pandemic, it never went beyond this 48-hour period. And this is something just no journal can really achieve. So it's a lot quicker. and it really does mean work is made almost immediately available. And just to put this in another format, this really can take a long time, and it is so shut off, and it's damaging just to you as a researcher, never mind to academia more broadly. Whereas your preprint posted, shared with the community, you can update it, you can share the updates with the community, you can send your preprint to journal independent review services, so you can actually get a peer-reviewed preprint, which again is this whole process is public and everybody can see what's going on. It's transparent. People can trust the work a bit more than you can with this hidden box method. The preprints are very much about changing the system. And currently, there are over 50 different preprint servers with biomedical scopes. These are just some of them. And these servers, there's a lot of different experiments going on with the different servers and how they work. They all work a little bit differently from one another. Some are owned by publishers, some are owned by more community-focused entities. Some have regional focuses, some have field focuses, some are very general. It can be quite a difficult thing to figure out which one to use. So some preprint servers have a very regional focus, and these are things like Africa Archive, India Archive, although I don't think that exists anymore. Japan Archive, China Archive. Cielo is a Spanish preprint server that is doing particularly well, actually. And these are really good if you want to publish in non-English, or if you do some work that is relevant to a particular region. Most preprint servers that I'm going to be talking about are restricted to the sciences, but there are humanities-based preprint servers and social sciences preprint servers as well. We've got like there's a medieval preprint server, for example, which is recent. It just covers medieval history. But we're focused on the life sciences here to answer that question in the chat. Some preprint servers have a field focus. Yeah, I've got paleoarchive in there. So you have chemistry, you have agriculture, you have earth, psychology, nutrition science, paleoarchaeology type servers. And these are things maybe you want to post something that is very field specific. Other preprint servers, as I said, have a very general focus, and these are things like bioarchive or Research Square or SSRN, and they're much more broad. I just want to focus on bioarchive for the next couple of slides to talk about the screening processes and how they actually work. So I said that you can't just post anything onto a preprint server. They have screening processes in place. And this is the process that bioarchive use. So bioarchive have what they call affiliates, and these are people who will go through and read all the manuscripts to check that they meet certain criteria. So when you submit your manuscript to bioarchive, it goes through a various different series of checks. One of those is a plagiarism check. And once it's gone through those checks, it then gets sent to the affiliates. They screen the paper, and effectively they're asking two questions. So one is, does the manuscript present biological research? Because bioarchive is a biology-based preprint server. And the other is there potential for public harm from posting this work as a preprint? And this is where bioarchive separate out things that they think really needs peer review. medRxiv, which is run by the same people at bioarchive, is more medical focused, and that has slightly more stringent screening processes. But you can see here that this means two things. One, you can't publish just anything on the server. It is checked and it has to be actual science. And it has to fit with what the server is about. You couldn't just post anything on there. For example, you can't post literature reviews on bioarchive. And the second thing here is that it does acknowledge where peer review has an important role, which is protecting the public from harm from scientific research. And that is things primarily that are more medical based, more clinical based things. So once the affiliates have screened that process, if they say it's okay, then that paper appears online. And as I said, this whole process takes at most 48 hours, usually. Every now and then you will get something that takes a little bit longer, but that 48 hours is the average time. Skipped ahead. And the other thing you can do with most preprint servers, but again, just BioArchive as an example, is you can also then update your preprint. So updating your preprint does not go through quite the same process. It still goes through the initial screening check, but you don't need to have an affiliate screen your paper again. And still, updating it takes around sort of the 48 hours mark. There's a point in the chat about preprints offer rapid dissemination of research findings, but they lack the rigorous peer review process that helps ensure the quality and reliability of published research. Peer review does not ensure the quality and reliability of published research. Any bit of data you look at that is scientifically assessing peer review as a process will tell you it does not do those two things. It fails miserably at doing those two things. It's a common thing that for some reason we all think it does. And I think we've just kind of been conditioned to expect that it does these things, but it doesn't. The other thing in this comment is that this means there's a risk of misinformation or poorly validated findings being circulated that could negatively impact researchers who rely on preprints for the work. No matter where you are going to get examples of misinformation or just really crap work that's published out there. There's a lot of that in the journals that has been peer reviewed, so that tells you that peer review does not ensure quality and reliability. And there is some on preprint servers. I refer you back to COVID as an example. There was early on in COVID, a preprint was posted to BioArchive, and this preprint was suggesting that the COVID virus had similarity to HIV. Terrible, terrible bit of work. The community responded very, very quickly to highlight how many issues were in that preprint, and this all happened in public, so everybody, even whether you're a scientist or not, whether you're an expert or not, you could understand that this was a very problematic bit of work, and that was withdrawn, I think within 2 days. It might have been quicker than that. That's an incredibly quick feedback mechanism. It's a public feedback mechanism, and that protects the literature. Now, there's also plenty of examples where journals have posted work during COVID that was highly problematic. I'll not name names, but there's a very famous French institute that is currently in a lot of trouble. Those papers, some of those have been now been removed. They were not removed that quickly. They existed for months with, as I said, this stamp and validation of peer review, and so therefore must be good. I would argue, preprints really protect the literature more than we give them credit for. The other thing that happens at BioArchive is that when you submit your manuscript, you can do a number of different things. So one of the things you can do is you could send that manuscript straight to a journal. So this is they call this B2J, so BioArchive 2 journal. You could also submit this to an external author service or peer review service. This is BioArchive 2X external. And they've got this new one more recently, which is B2C, which is BioArchive 2 Community, which is a bit confusing because that's also a peer review service, but it's community-based peer review services. And you can do this whenever you submit your manuscript or you update your manuscript. Now, this means it's got direct integration with a bunch of different journals, so it's a very easy process to do preprint peer review journal or preprint journal. My suggestion would always be, if you do use preprints, to post your preprint and then wait maybe a month or so before you submit to a journal, because this allows you to get feedback. So you could update before you have to go through the peer review process. But you also get things like how many people are reading and accessing your work, which gives you an idea as to how impactful it is. And you can use those in cover letters to journals. We did this with some of the stuff we've done during COVID, and like the preprint got a huge amount of attention. The other thing is, if you wait, if your work is good, you do get editors from journals who will approach you and ask you to submit. I had a friend who's just started his own lab up recently, and everyone in his department told him he would never ever get his work into his journal of choice. He posted a preprint, and the journal of choice, the editor asked him to submit his work to that journal, and he's now published in that journal. That wouldn't have happened if he'd listened to his colleagues and if he hadn't posted a preprint. So there's a huge benefit to you as researchers to do this. And that doesn't happen to everyone. Like I said, your work does have to be particularly good, and it has to stand out. But also I think it's unfair to just expect everyone's work to receive a huge amount of attention. That's not how science works. It's not how life works, unfortunately. So there are a lot of benefits to waiting. Just before I move on to some of the questions. So can one cite a preprint as we cite a published article? Yes, and you should cite preprints. It's incredibly unethical to use a preprint to inform your work and then not cite it. Journals have, I mean, Claire's responded to this, but journals do have different policies as to how that needs to be cited. Some of them require you to highlight that it is a preprint you're citing, some of them don't. So you need to know what that relates to for your journal. But you can cite preprints and you really, really should cite preprints. There's a question about the difference between a published article and a preprint. So there's a lot of differences. Preprints are not journal organized peer review. They are updatable. They're not, so publishers very much refer to things as being the version of record, the VOR, which you might see in these kind of discussions. That is like the final version of something. You don't update that, you don't really change it, that's it, done. Preprints are not that. I have various issues with version of record and whether it's relevant in modern times, but it's the fixed final version of something. That's probably maybe the biggest difference between them. So the other thing about, again, just focus on bioRxiv here. This is one of our papers. I said you get a lot of different information with preprints, like how many people have been reading it. And this is one of those reasons to wait. So bioRxiv has a little metrics tab, and that gives you downloads, number of readers, useful metric data. It's really good for you as a researcher before you submit. The other thing that bioRxiv has is this toolbar. And what they're doing here is they're really beginning to bring together a lot of different indicators to give you an idea as to how much you can maybe trust a bit of work, or at the lowest level, maybe how popular a bit of work is. So they bring together any comments that are left on the preprint. They bring together any peer reviews that are left for the preprint. They bring together any news reports that they can, and they bring also tweets in one place. So you've now got your preprint and all these other things all in one place, all publicly accessible. Now this, I'm biased, it was me, but this was a good bit of work. There are some examples, but again, particularly over COVID, where there are tens of thousands of tweets and there are hundreds of comments on a preprint. To me, that's never going to happen with a good bit of work. That's always a good indicator that the work you're reading is probably highly problematic. And so this actually works really well as an indicator of trust, or at least as the beginnings of an indicator of trust, which is where I think generally things are moving towards having this kind of mindset and trying to do something like this for all articles. There are a bunch of other things on here that I'm not going to go through, but I would suggest taking a look at bioRxiv if you want to have a look at a preprint server. And so that's a quick overview of the current issues and preprints more generally. Next week we'll go into the current landscape of preprints a lot more in depth. But if you wanted to get involved with preprints, you want to get started now, the next 3 slides are kind of how you would do that. So ASAPbio has a lot of resources for preprints, so I would suggest you go to our website to have a look at what we've got there. It's not the best organized website at the moment. We've got a lot of different resources. We've got a whole FAQ section. You can learn a lot about preprints just from going to our website. We also have a Slack channel and a newsletter, so if you want to keep up with what we're doing or you want to join these conversations, you can join those things. And every year we run a fellows program. We're actually about to start that tomorrow, where we train people around the world in everything to do with preprints and preprint advocacy. We also have a community schedule, which is available from this link here for this year. We already are 4 in, and you can find the recordings on our YouTube through these links. I should share my slides with you in the chat. There you go, copy the slides. So you can click on these links from the slide deck and it will take you straight through to the YouTube for each of these recordings. We have community calls where we have external speakers come in and talk, and we have what we call lunch and learns because they happen at US lunch times. And these are topics where I take something that is relevant, even tangentially, to preprints, and we go a bit more in depth for half an hour. So, for example, we've done the history of peer review. We talk about the role of Robert Maxwell. If you're not sure who he is, I Google him. He's a very interesting if that's the right word, man. We also, through these, we're going to do some sessions around sort of how you can really get involved. So the next Lunch and Learn, for example, is how to write an opinion piece pitch for preprint related things. Our next community call next month is around the use of AI in publishing and preprints. So these are quite a good way of getting involved without doing any real work. There are other variations to really, I think, are the nice stepping points into preprints. So Prelight is an organization that effectively functions like news and views, but for preprints. So you can join this and you can write news and views articles on preprints. This was my introduction to preprints, and it's a really easy, gentle way into it all. It's not a huge amount of work. Pre-review is one of the big preprint review platforms. So if you want to start reviewing preprints, this is where you could post those reviews. And again, it's a really good team behind that. They do a lot of training as well. I don't know if they're involved in this series, but they might be doing some of the training for this. And the other thing is we have a bunch of different initiatives you can get involved with. One of the current ones is if you have a journal club, we're currently providing money to convert that journal club into a preprint review club that you can apply for here. And that is the end of this session. We'll open it up to questions, but just before I do end, there you go, pre-review are involved in this training. To finish this off, and you can do this after the session, there's a Google form link here, which I believe will also be sent out to you. Maybe I can put that in the Slack chat as well. Have I copied it? I have. Oh, I got it. There we go. So that's a link to the Google form here, which has 2 reflective questions based on this session. So I don't want you to write a huge amount for this, 250-ish words will do. But I want you to think about what the biggest issue with the current publishing system is in your mind and how you think preprints can solve that problem. And I might have covered that, I might not have covered that. And then the other question here is to think about the biggest reason people should use preprints and why you think that's the most important reason. The third session might be more helpful for you for this one when Claire talks about the pros and cons, but I've kind of hinted at what I think the biggest reason is without directly saying it. And I'm not going to directly say it because that would be giving you my answer. So just to finish off questions. ASAPbio is a very small organization. Jessica used to be the executive director. She now consults for us every now and then. And we have, effectively, it's me and Katie, all the permanent staff, and I do all the comms. And then we have a small board of directors as well. The next session next week will be about the history and current landscape of preprints. And as I said, if you want to get in touch after this, you can find me pretty much everywhere. I'm not hard to reach. But I think we can now open that up to any questions people have.
Thank you, Jonny, very much for this really lovely and eye-opening presentation about, as you said, the current issues that we face with the traditional publishing system and how preprints could be an answer to or a solution to all of these issues. And yeah, as I said in the chat, we're also lucky that and happy that peer review are going to also be presenting in this training. So I think now we could, as Jonny said, we could open the floor for questions. So if you have a question, you could raise your hand or maybe write it in the chat.
I have a question, Jonny. That was a great talk. Thank you. Do you think preprints will replace journals at some point?
Have you asked me this before? Someone's asked me this before
I
recently.
don't think I did. I feel like this is a slight ambush, but go on.
So, I think they will all exist together, but I think so. One thing I didn't say here is for everyone else, physics and maths, for example, their approach to publishing is very different to us. So in those disciplines, you actually post your preprint. So you post your preprint, and then it's more of a formality to submit to a journal. I think we will eventually go towards that kind of system where preprints are the basis. As I kind of said, I think the role for journals is much more in curation. There's a lot of editorial experience, there's a lot of experience there that we shouldn't disregard and we shouldn't forget about. And if we can remove that financial incentive or at least shift it to something that is reasonable, then there's a huge space for journals to keep operating. It's just how they operate and sort of what form that might take. But I don't think preprint will replace journals.
We have a question from Musa. Go ahead, Musa, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you very much for this eye-opening session, and I think completely it's a new idea for me. So the question I have is, can we directly send a manuscript for preprint? And usually if we send to a journal, they ask us to, they give us a choice to for preprint, or if we are okay, we can send for preprint. So my question is, can we directly send a paper for preprint? Another question is maybe conflict of interest and may arise between those who handle a preprint and a journal. So do you think this conflict of interest may happen between the journal and those institution, or whoever they are who handle this preprint? Another question is, you have clearly mentioned it is incentive is entirely profit driven, and this is not how science works. I agree with this idea, but my worry is what will motivate a researcher or a scientist. For example, in our institution, we are asked to present a paper during promotion, which are published in peer-reviewed journal. And so now I think direction is changing to a preprint, maybe in the future. Preprint will take a place. So do you have any platform to promote such kind of work in an institution like universities and research institution? Thank you very much. That's my question.
I'll start with the last one because I can remember that one. So we do have a really big focus for us as an organization over the next few years is institutional recognition for preprints. This is much bigger in Western Europe and the US. There's a lot more recognition for preprints from funding bodies and from universities. Part of the current issue is that a lot of places do require you to have peer-reviewed papers for those processes. The reason they use peer-reviewed papers is they rely on those poor proxies and metrics. They do that to assess you. They do that when you're applying for a position to narrow the pool of applicants down, because it's always easier to use a number to make those kind of cutoffs than it is to go through and read hundreds of applications and try and judge scientists by that. One thing we're seeing in this area is a shift towards narrative CVs a lot more, which I think is a much better way of really trying to figure out a researcher and what they're about and what they have achieved. And it gets a little bit away from those metrics. But it's a slowly changing aspect that we are working on. The first question, so when you submit a preprint, you can, as I said, you can then send that at the same time to a journal. Equally, a lot of journals now, I don't want to say most, but I imagine probably most, when you submit your manuscript to a journal, you can also at the same time send that automatically to a preprint server. So you can do it both ways. I would always recommend posting a preprint and waiting a month. It's just, you get the benefits of preprints by doing that. If you do it at the same time as submitting to a journal, you lose a lot of the benefits you can kind of gain. But that's the choice of the person submitting. And what was your question about? You're going to have to repeat the question about conflict of interest.
Okay, as you have mentioned, you can first you can send for preprint and then wait, and then we can send to a journal. Like this manuscript can appear both in a journal and also in a preprint. So maybe in the future, which one we are going to use, which is published in a journal, or which is so preprint. And so maybe, I don't know, like if you send one paper to two different journals, I think that's not ethically right. Now, maybe, I don't know, what if this happens in preprint and also in a journal.
So preprint servers generally won't allow you to post a preprint if it's already been published in a journal. And it's because that's not what a preprint is meant to be about. It's not a way to just get around access charges and things like that. When you're looking at the literature, it's a difficult thing to do sometimes, but these efforts are improving all the time in terms of linking the preprint and the peer-reviewed version together. Now, preprint servers try really hard to make sure they link the preprint to its final peer-reviewed version, and I would always say you use the most recent version. However, if the most recent version is a journal article that's behind a paywall that you can't afford to access, use the most recent version of the preprint, because when you cite an article, you cite the version you've used, so people know what you've used. And the other thing that I haven't presented here is there's a lot of data now comparing preprints to their peer-reviewed versions. The key conclusions don't really change. It's a slightly strengthened version of an article when it's peer-reviewed, but for the overwhelming majority of the literature, the key conclusions don't change. So if you cite a preprint because that's what you can access, the chances are the conclusions are going to be the same in the peer-reviewed version anyway. But also, as I said, the citation tells the reader what it is you cited, so it shouldn't be an issue. But where possible, always use the most recent final version, whether that's the last updated preprint or if there is a published version, use that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Musa. And we also have a question from Nidal. So go ahead, Nidal, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, good evening. Actually, I didn't know if my question is relevant or not, but I have my my startup, which is for digitalizing research process, and I'm thinking to integrate services that help the researcher to ensure or to evaluate their work before they submit it for a journal or to be published. So is there a procedure or a system that can I combine in my platform so it can be as a service, or there is something else that I can do?
So there are probably things you could do. I don't know if that's quite the purview of this talk. So what I would suggest is go and look at Research Square as an example. They have a lot of services. So Research Square is a preprint server, but they offer a lot of additional services around that they charge for to help improve the manuscript in some way. So I would have a look at what they offer and see what you could kind of adapt from that.
Okay.
Okay. If you're done, Nidal, we could.
No, actually,
okay,
I
go
want.
ahead.
Yeah. Not. If I would like to integrate it as a system, not just for evaluation, but also as a checkpoint for the process in all. So it will be also entitled as a preprint, or what will be like?
You would have to talk to the preprint servers for that. That's not something I can help with. But they could tell you how to incorporate with their processes and how that works.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nidal. We have also Paul who raised his hand. You can unmute and ask your question.
Yes. Thank you very much, our facilitator. My question, I've asked some questions on the chat box, but I still want your clarification on this preprints, because I know that preprints still require some processes in order to finalize it for publication. And that's the reason why I asked, can we cite preprints in our article to be published, or in some academic work like a dissertation or thesis? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, you can cite preprints as you would cite a journal article. And as I said, I think it would be highly unethical to read a preprint and base something you're writing off of that preprint and not cite it. Journals will have different requirements for how you cite that, but preprints are citable. They have a DOI, they're permanent records and should be cited. And you can do that for grants and for journal articles.
Okay, thank you. We also have Joseph. Please unmute and ask your question.
Okay. Thank you, Lami. Good afternoon, everybody. I have a little difficulty with representation concerning the preprints, the way the communicator has presented the preprints. So I am a librarian, and I would like to know who guarantees the reliability of a preprint article, because when he is presenting his doing his presentation, he talked about peer reviews have some problems, and preprint can be used by researchers to be cited in their work.
So
who guarantee the reliability of a preprint article?
So the research community guarantees the reliability of preprint articles.
Is it the author only and his co-author only? Because an article must be peer reviewed before accepted, before it can be accepted to be used in a document or in a work to be cited.
Okay, so
I don't know if you understand my
No,
question, my preoccupation.
I understand the question. So an article does not need to be peer reviewed to be cited and used. As the last question was. The other thing here is, what I would suggest is you go and read the literature that looks at the comparisons between, actually let me Google it while I'm answering, the comparisons between a preprint and the preprint peer review. I wrote an opinion piece a while back, let me see if I can find that to drop in the chat. Basically, there is an increasingly growing body of evidence where researchers who are not connected to each other take a preprint and take the peer-reviewed version, and they look to see how it changes, how it's different. And every single study that I've found so far would tell you there's very limited changes. Now, that doesn't mean peer review is not important or is not in some ways capturing issues, because it probably is. But it's not this vital, essential process that we need to protect the scientific literature. Now, when you post a preprint, again, this is kind of depends what you define as peer review, because I would argue, at least in my experience, I have never shared work publicly that I've not had feedback on. Now, that feedback is private, right? It's sharing it with people in my department, for example, or maybe I've shared it with some people who I might have collaborated with in the past. That is a form of peer review. So your work, before you even submit it to a preprint server, has really been mostly peer reviewed. So there is also that element in there. When you submit to a preprint server, your work is out there for everyone to read. If you've posted really bad quality work, the community know you've done that, and it will increasingly become an issue in the future where when you do that, you struggle to find jobs because people now know you're actually not a very good scientist. And that's clearer than it is with peer review, where you've had a bunch of other people help improve your work or prevent you from sharing something that was terrible to begin with. The other thing here is there's a lot of different feedback mechanisms that can be at play that are very public with preprints. So you can have preprint peer review. You can have that in a very normal, traditional looking peer review. So this is things like what pre-review as a service do. Review Commons is another one. You can also have what you would class as non-traditional peer review. So this could be things like Twitter comments. And that sounds a little bit weird, but a single comment on a preprint can be incredibly important. So Twitter shouldn't be discounted as a feedback mechanism. And as I showed you, when certainly on bioRxiv, they have this toolbar which brings all of these different things together so that maybe you don't have experience in this particular thing you're reading, right? So I'm an immunologist. I don't know all that much about biochemistry. So if I'm reading a biochemistry preprint and I want to know how good it is, I can use that toolbar and I can look at what everyone else has been saying about it. And hopefully there will be useful comments that are somewhat in the form of peer review that I can use to then judge that bit of work. If a preprint is really, really bad, as I give it, the example was that COVID example I gave during the talk, but there's plenty of others, they can be removed and they can be removed very, very quickly. Journals are generally very reluctant to remove work, and it's an incredibly difficult process to do. I don't know if you're aware of some of the like Elizabeth Bisk, for example, who her job now is just to go through the literature and find duplications and publications with papers. And she frequently takes to social media to complain about how difficult it is to get journals to remove work that she's identified as being fraudulent, for example. So you've also got that other side of it where you have a system that you're arguing is incredibly important because it protects the literature when it doesn't. It's more problematic than any of us would like to admit it is. And preprints are a way of changing that.
Okay. My fear is that as a lab, I cannot allow a preprint document to be communicated to users. I think it's a little difficult for me to allow them to use a preprint document instead of peer review documents as book, article, or journal, and so on. That is my great fear.
If there is a peer-reviewed version, absolutely use that. The problem you're going to face in the future is everyone else is using preprints, and that means everyone else is going to be like 2 years ahead of you in terms of where the field is. And so we are at the point now where it's a question of either you put your concerns to one side and jump on board, or you then have to start producing evidence that backs up your concerns. And people have tried. And as I said, there is a lot of evidence around preprints at the moment. And it does kind of all lean towards the same thing, which is that it's not that they are reliable. The evidence tells you that a preprint is as reliable as a peer-reviewed article. So if you trust a peer-reviewed article, you should trust a preprint. If you don't trust a preprint, you shouldn't trust a peer-reviewed article, because so far I've yet to see anything that does not say they are basically the same in terms of quality. There'll always be outliers, obviously, but for a whole, that's where things currently stand.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
If I may add something, Jonny, I think if we're talking about the African context, like already African produced research is under a lot of bias. So I feel what we would feel as Africans is if I include in my article that I'm trying to produce a preprint, then this would sort of increase the bias, and like basically people saying, oh, you're not using reliable science. So I think especially for us in Africa, I don't know, I feel like we have to wait a bit more until preprints are like solidly established in the global north, until we would be able to convince like fellow researchers and academics about, oh, look, like now it's a norm. Unfortunately, this is the truth. Like we sort of follow the global north. So I think this is what is one of the main issues that we would face in Africa. Yeah.
So we did some closed workshops last year with Indian-based researchers, And effectively, they said the same thing, which is that they really struggle with how things are currently perceived locally for them. And at the same time, the global north is very rapidly accepting preprints in the same kind of way a peer-reviewed article is. And that's not happening in the global south. In fact, a lot of places in the global south aren't aware of what a preprint is. And there's a huge disparity building. And I'm very conscious of trying to put a lot of effort into not allowing that to build more than it already is, because preprints offer a great opportunity to level and provide a lot more equity and equality in the system. And it would be a huge loss if we did not capture that. And I currently don't think we are capturing that to the effect we should be. And it is right. It is, if your institution, for example, does not accept preprints when they are going to promote you, that means you need to publish your work. Now, it doesn't mean you can't use preprints, but you can't just use preprints. And even in the global north, where we generally accept peer-reviewed preprints, not just preprints, you still need to publish the work in journals to kind of move up, really. It's almost impossible to do that, to move up in academia without publishing in a journal. That, for everyone, is still a long way off. What I would say is that it doesn't matter where you are, you can use preprints, you can cite them. It shouldn't detract from the work you're doing because you cited a preprint. I produced work and cited tweets in it, which should probably detract from the work a little bit. But you do need to, there's a certain amount of waiting to do, and I understand that, but at the same time, I think you also need to take hold and kind of take charge a little bit and take the lead a little bit where you can, which maybe is just citing a preprint. Maybe that's all you can do at the moment, and that's a good start.
Yeah, and I think this is exactly what we're trying to do with Aren, is maybe not even citing a preprint, just knowing that they exist. Because I think many African researchers don't know that they exist. So even just bringing awareness about preprints, I think it's a huge step. And one other issue that I would like to share, and I think many African research share, is like in Africa, in order to produce one publication, like you put blood and sweat on it. You usually have to pay for many things out of your own pocket. It's so much effort is put into one paper, so you kind of feel or maybe it's a jeopardy to jeopardize your work by publishing a preprint. So I think, yeah, I think it's important to study these the rationale behind especially Africans not being apprehensive about publishing preprints.
And
Yeah.
that's a really good point. We as an organization, our whole thing is you should use preprints.
Yeah.
But the approach you take is very, very different now, depending on who you're interacting with, because so the global north are at a point where, well, at least Western Europe and the US, where if you have a peer-reviewed preprint, that is now almost blanket considered the same as a peer-reviewed journal article. Now, in hiring decisions, I don't know if in practice it really works out that way, but in theory, that's where we're now at. Whereas, as you just said, right, in Africa, there's just generally a lack of awareness of what even a preprint is, never mind being at that point. And the other thing is that the challenges and the things people are concerned about are also very, very different geographically. There's a big fear, I call it the myth now. So in the global north, there was a big fear about being scooped if you post a preprint. That's not, it is a myth. It's not true. But that's not true in the global north. In places like Africa, where I'm very aware of how difficult it can be to do research there. And, if I want to do a sequencing experiment, for example, I could do that and get the data back within like a week, which is an incredible privilege to have. But I understand that means, if you're in a position where you can't do that, scooping is suddenly not a myth. It's a very real possibility. And I've had conversations with people based in India and Africa in particular who have said, they've put some work out and then a Western lab has come along and scooped them because they can do it quicker. And so one of the challenges we have is really trying to adapt the approaches we're doing and sort of what we're communicating so that it fits the needs of the communities we're interacting with. And so it's a difficult thing to manage, but we're trying, I think.
Yeah, and I think like you being part of like a community like Aren is also like giving you some feedback about how people think. So I'm aware that we took so much of your time, Jonny, but do you have time for one more question? We have one raised hand. Okay, so Banjo, you could ask your question.
Thank you so much. It's not really a question, it's a comment. First, I want to appreciate you for our presenter for giving us this talk on preprint. It's really enlightening. And for me, I'm surprised that the Global South is not taken to preprint. To me, from the way it's presented today, it's like preprint is going to be a lot more better than peer review. And because there's that tendency that at the end of preprint review, your publication will be accepted. Unlike where only two people will look at it and they will just like, no, and that is the end. But with preprint review, from the way it's presented today, which personally I think I'm going to embrace, so that you will have all the necessary correction and it will be an easy step for the journal to actually publish it. That's just my own comment. I hope and I wish most of our colleagues in the Global South will accept it. Thank you.
I don't know if it is a surprise that it's not as accepted. I think there's a huge reluctance to do anything different in science. Scientists are some of the most conservative people I've ever met, which continues to surprise me because you wouldn't think they are. And so there's a huge reluctance to just change things, but also all of our systems are built around the current journal publication way of doing things. All of the ways of assessing a researcher are based around the current journal system. And you know, I've presented preprints hopefully as objectively as I can, but I said a few times throughout that you know you will get a lot of attention if your work is particularly interesting. As I'm sure nobody wants to admit, but we all really secretly know, most of what you produce as a scientist is interesting to you and a very small number of other people. It's not going to get a huge amount of attention. It's not a bad thing. That's how science works. It should be like that. It's small steps. But that does mean, and I've had this conversation with people who post to preprints, a lot of people will post a preprint and they'll not see all these benefits I've just spoken about. And it's not because their work is bad, it's just there's a limited attention span in academia. And so there's a lot of challenges around getting people to use preprints. And the other side of that, of course, is you've got the big publishers who are incredibly rich and they put a lot of money and resources behind keeping things the way they are. So I referred to peer review quite a lot in this talk because one of the things you're going to see a lot of in the next few years in particular is a huge focus on how important peer review is. And that's because that is the way that journals are currently separating themselves out from preprints. And they're really doubling down on that, and they're really saying that peer review is this essential process. Now, it wasn't in this talk, but I could give you an entire 2-hour talk on all of the data that exists to tell you that peer review does not work in its current form. But the journals are ignoring that because they make huge amounts of money. And so that's what they want to keep doing. It's not to the benefit of the scientific community, but they don't care about that ultimately. And so this is where I kind of said it's up to us to kind of be the change. We have to push for changes to happen. And it has to be a big community effort to do so.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. I think you touched on a very important point that maybe we should focus more on is highlighting the issues with the peer review, the current peer review, so that people don't think of it as, you know, the gold standard of ensuring that this work has good quality or not. So I think that this is something we should definitely add or try to address in this training. So again, thank you very much, Jonny. I guess I told you that there will be a lot of interactions, and I think there is, and we're glad that there are 2 more sessions with you. Hopefully by then we could have more rich discussions and answer more questions. So thank you very much, Jonny, and thank you very much for our trainees who lingered on for another extra half hour. And yeah, hope to see you next week again. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.